This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. This week, my guest is Matt Brown from The Athletic, an AP college football poll voter, one of the most knowledgeable people I know about the past and present of our favorite sport. We're talking College Football Hall of Fame with Matt this week. He and I did this exercise last year where we take the recently released College Football Hall of Fame ballot and pick a class of 13 players and 2 coaches to make the Hall of Fame. We also talk a little bit about future Hall of Famer, at least I think he'll be a future Hall of Famer, Reggie Bush, who was brought back into the fold at USC after a 10-year ban by the NCAA. After our conversation, I have a few thoughts on player empowerment and the latest mini uprising in college football, this time at Oklahoma State. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcasts. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Matt Brown is an editor for The Athletic, college football side. He is an AP voter, one of my favorite AP voters because he does deep dives on the poll every week. He is really thorough and diligent. As I like to tell people, there are very few people I know in the sport, covering the sport right now, who know it with a wider breadth of knowledge than Matt Brown from The Athletic. So, Matt, thanks for joining me today for our Hall of Fame edition of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for the kind words, and thanks for having me, Ralph.
Awesome. Let's start with this before we get into the Hall of Fame stuff. Last week, after this podcast was recorded, the big news in college football, certainly toward the end of the week, there seems to be a lot of big news in college football almost every day, which is amazing because none of it is actually going on. But that's a story for another time. The big, one of the interesting stories in college football last week that I didn't get to cover was Reggie Bush is now no longer disassociated from USC. The NCAA sanctions ran out, and he is now back in the fold at USC. And I guess the first thing I would ask him, Matt, is, Reggie Bush was a star right when I started this job. So my first year sort of doing this national gig, I covered a lot of his games because obviously USC was so awesome and he was so awesome. I'm trying to put his career in perspective, and I think the more we get away from it and the more the sort of the sanctions fade into the background and his NFL career is now over, I think in some ways, I'm starting to appreciate just how great he was now, maybe even more than I did while he was in the pros. I'm wondering what your feeling is on that.
Yeah, I think we're kind of seeing a resurgence of appreciation for just how great he was. I mean, he's a guy who, was so hyped out of high school and, met that hype in college. But then when you talk about the sanctions that happened, when you talk about what happened in the national championship game, which caused people to say, well, Vince Young should have won the Heisman. And then, his NFL career didn't go, he had a good NFL career, but I think he's like unfairly almost called a bust just because he didn't live up to the really high expectations of a number 2 pick with his kind of pedigree. But I'm of the opinion that he did deserve the Heisman when the Heisman was given before the bowl game. And he was, just this kind of transcendent player with, it was like a guy, I don't know who it was who said it on Twitter. I'm sorry that I'm kind of stealing this, but somebody pointed out that Reggie Bush looked like his high school highlight tape in college, which is hard to say for a lot of guys, but it was true. Some of the plays that he had in college. So, he did it. It was multidimensional, and he's playing really kind of in a conventional USC offense. If you think about it, it wasn't some, the USC offense of today or anything is pretty conventional. But he's almost ahead of his time, which is weird to say about somebody 15 years ago. So I think, I did all decade teams for every decade in college football history last year, and he was a clear choice as one of the running backs for the 2000s. And I'm glad to see him kind of being welcomed back as everybody changes their attitudes about NCAA sanctions and things like the Bush violations. I think it's kind of ridiculous that he would have been disassociated from USC. I still think it's ridiculous that he doesn't have his Heisman Trophy. So I'm all for Reggie Bush being acknowledged and appreciated as an all-time great, and we don't have to have some asterisk next to his name.
Yeah, I do hope, it'll be an interesting process of how they go back and revisit the Heisman situation with him. You make a great point about how because of what Vince Young did in that championship game, it in some ways, it unfairly, for some reason, tainted Reggie Bush, right? Bush, the funny thing is, we remember the championship game a lot about the fumble that he had, that lateral fumble, because it was such an enormous play. But I go back and look at it. He had a pretty good championship game, Bush. He had that spectacular touchdown run. He caught a bunch of passes. It wasn't one of his most dominant games, but he certainly had a very good championship game. And you're right. It's just the dynamic between him and Peterson. Excuse me, and I'm thinking Adrian Peterson because he's the other guy I would think of like when running backs of his era. The dynamic between him and Vince Young and the idea that, well, in some ways Young was slighted. He wasn't really. I mean, within that moment, Reggie Bush was as spectacular a player, a running back, as we had seen in college football in a long, long time. I'm just, again, covering so many of his games and just watching him and thinking, I can't underestimate this. He really was the type of player. We say this a lot. Every time he touched the ball, you thought he was going to score. He was that type of player that really epitomized that. Like it literally felt that way very often. I remember the Notre Dame game especially, where it just seemed like he was a step away on every play. You found yourself, oh my goodness, there goes Reggie. And again, a spectacular player. And I will be interested to see how this plays out with the Heisman. So you would like him to get the Heisman back. But I don't know how that works unless all of a sudden the Heisman one day just says, okay, we've punished you long enough, and then we're just going to hand it back to you.
Pretending that things didn't happen in college.
Yeah, I'm big with
wins.
that too.
I don't like vacated awards. He won the Heisman. He didn't cheat on the field or anything. Like I don't know. I just think it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, and I still refer to him as Heisman winner. Right?
Yes,
I always refer to him as a Heisman winner in copy, and maybe at some point explain that it was vacated later on. But in my mind, and he is still a Heisman winner to me because he actually did win the Heisman. So that was an interesting story that came about last week. So Reggie Bush is not eligible yet. Well, let me ask you one other thing with Reggie. And I probably should have been better prepared and had his NFL stats in front of me. But the other thing that was interesting about Bush is he was this sort of multi-talented guy. In fact, the breakout game I remember for Reggie Bush was the 2004 season, the opener against Virginia Tech. I don't know if you remember this game. It was played at FedEx Field. And USC was breaking in all these new wide receivers. That was the one questionable part of that team that year, was they had all these new wide receivers. Maybe I'm getting this wrong. Maybe it was the 2005 opener. It was the opener to
2004.
It was 4. Okay. And Bush was a sophomore, and basically, they threw the ball to him a whole bunch that game because they didn't have their receivers, worked out, and he ended up having this huge receiving game. And I do wonder, you talk about being ahead of his time only 15 years ago, even for the Saints, when he got to the Saints, they had Deuce McAllister, and it was going to be sort of a thunder and lightning thing. Sean Payton's offense and offenses in general, the NFL, hadn't evolved to the point where they are now. I do wonder if simply being 10 or 15 years later, he would have been used differently and valued differently. We would have been past the point where we just sort of focused very heavily on the rushing numbers of NFL running backs and gone to the idea that no, they're playmakers in multifaceted ways. But it's interesting that you say ahead of his time, even though it was not that long ago.
Yeah, I just think, I mean, he couldn't have, I guess I don't want to say he could have been in a better situation because he was playing with a ridiculously talented roster in a dynasty in the mid-2000s at USC. But it's also the type of guy who, yeah, I would like to see, like, what would he have done in, like, Chip Kelly's Oregon offense? Or, you know, in the Oklahoma offense right now where the running backs are still capable of putting up big numbers. So it's just, he's an interesting guy in that varied skill set. You know, that Virginia Tech game you mentioned, USC only scored 3 touchdowns in that game. All 3 of those touchdowns were Reggie Bush catches. So that's a very interesting one to point out because, you know, he had 9 carries for 27 yards in that game, but 127 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns and kind of a otherwise somewhat shaky game for USC. So we kind of saw that a lot from him. He just beat you in different ways. And then he clinched the Heisman, though, by doing, you know, he had that 294-yard game against Fresno State and 260 against UCLA. And that's how you clinch a Heisman. Yeah,
I was at the UCLA game. Again, so many of their games I covered that year. I was at that UCLA game, and it was, again, one of those games where it's like, there he goes again. There he goes again. Like it was bizarre. He was video game like. We use that again a lot, and sometimes overuse that. But he was definitely one of those players. So in a few years, you know, let's extend the conversation to the Hall of Fame. I didn't think we would go this direction, but it'll be interesting to see what Reggie Bush and where Reggie Bush ends up with his Hall of Fame candidacy when it comes to college football as well. Eric Dickerson just got into the Hall of Fame last year because he was, again, sort of linked to the SMU scandal, which was, of course, one of the titanic scandals in the history of college football. And the Hall of Fame doesn't have a distinct policy, a spelled out policy about NCAA infractions and things along those lines. They do have some wording about character and values and ideals and things along those lines, but they don't have a laid out objective way of judging somebody who has been involved with the NCAA. But I would not be surprised if he has to wait a couple of years to get into the Hall of Fame because of his linkage to the NCAA scandal.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a few years, but we're not going to see another Dickerson-like situation. I just think attitudes have changed so much in terms of, you know, quote unquote pay for play and things like that. That I don't know. I think it might be a little bit of a delay, but I also think no longer being disassociated with USC helps. It's just you kind of saw that news and everybody's like, well, it's about time. So I think that will ultimately translate into his Hall of Fame candidacy whenever that comes up as well.
Yeah, and again, about 4 or 5 years from, I think they do about 5 years from the end of your career. Again, the College Hall of Fame is not quite as straightforward as a lot of the other Hall of Fames. Yeah. Schools get involved and they sort of push candidates, and sometimes they don't want to push too many candidates at once because nobody gets in more than one player per year, and often not more than you won't have the same school represented in 2 straight classes. So let's get into a little bit of that. Because the Hall of Fame can be a little exasperating for people who will look at the list and say, how is that guy not in? How is that guy not in? But from the sheer volume of players alone that need to be managed, it is almost an unmanageable task.
Exactly. I mean, you look at the list every year and it's 3/4 of them. I'm like, well, that guy should probably be in. And half of them, it's like, well, he should definitely be in. And at least 1/4 of them, it's exactly what you just said. How is he not already in? I know, like, Tommy Frazier was that case for a couple of years, it felt like. And we had a long discussion on this podcast about Dickerson last year. So there's definitely, it's always hard to choose. Like, you know, I see there's multiple Heisman winners on this list. I think they should just, like, I'm not even going to talk about them because I think Carson Palmer and Rashaan Salaam should just be in. They're Heisman winners. They're obviously College Football Hall of Famers. That's at least an really exclusive club. But, you know, there's a few on this list. I'm like, how? You know, we're starting to see, like, the bulk of this list or the bulk of the guys that I might talk about are kind of mid-90s to mid-2000s. That's kind of what we're starting to see with the window where there's going to be a backlog. Mm-hmm. But there's still guys from the 80s, the 70s that it's, wow, you know, he should be a College Football Hall of Famer. But it's just, I think the Hall of Fame will get a lot of criticism just because of that, but it's also, as you said, it's kind of an impossible task because there's just, guys only have 3, 4, 5 years at most in college, and they're all being judged based on kind of similar resumes in many respects. So it is hard to pick the ones that deserve to go in ahead of the others.
For a lot of years that I've been doing this, and just a little background, in the last 10 or 12 years, the Hall of Fame has become a lot more structured. They've tried to be more transparent about how they put players in, and they release the ballot and things along those lines. They're trying to, like, for decades and decades, one of the reasons why there was a backlog is the Hall of Fame was just off the radar, and it was inducting another Yale guy. It was not taken seriously, and it was not run like a serious Hall of Fame for decades. And the people who are running it now decided, no, we want this to be something that's respected and something that gains attention. So they've tried to catch up and have more players put in. One of the things they did, I noticed last year, and I don't know if this is a trend, again, to sort of catch up with the players, or if it was just a one-off from last year. Last year, 17 players were inducted. In the past years, it's been a little more in that 12 to 13 range. So maybe they're expanding it a little bit to try to get more players in. Regardless, it's still, again, an almost impossible task. So let me ask you about this. So the other challenging thing with Hall of Fame for college is, great in what context, right? Because I can find a player who played in the MAC who was great at that level, right, and maybe is all sort of all-time great. And that player to me could be a Hall of Famer. Or maybe there was a player who played at a more high-profile school and only played maybe 1 or 2 years where he was great because he bounced to the pros. So how do you judge that level of success? How do you judge the success of a guy who was a tremendous college player but had very little pro career? And you say, well, that isn't supposed to influence you at all. But it's hard not to be at least influenced a little bit by the idea that, and I'm looking at a good example, like a Josh Heupel, who was a great college quarterback at Oklahoma, but had no significant pro career. So do you ding him a little bit? Do you say, okay, he's going to wait a little bit? Do you not take that into account? There's just so many factors that come in here that make the College Football Hall of Fame nothing like any of the professional Hall of Fames.
Exactly. And you mentioned, like, if you look at group of 5 type players, I mean, one of the criteria for getting in now is you had to be a first-team All-American. And that makes it really hard for, like, a great group of 5 quarterback. I mean, there's multiple All-American teams. So there could be a couple first-team All-American quarterbacks in a season, but still it can be really hard for those guys to make the list. We see, there's usually, 2, 3, 4 group of 5 guys maybe on All-America teams at most, first team. So right there, it's hard for those type of guys who might put up huge numbers and deserve the recognition to get in. And then, you mentioned Heupel. It's the NFL career. It's also, he's a short career at Oklahoma as well, a JUCO guy. So it's always made it hard to judge these types of things. I mentioned I did last year all decade teams for every decade ever. It was the same type of thing. Like Cam Newton, probably the best individual season of any quarterback in the 2010s, but he had 1 year. So how do you compare that to, a guy who was a 3-year starter? It makes it tricky, but it just kind of also creates endless possible debates for this.
Yeah, and then you end up getting sometimes into a situation where you had a player who, that's the funny thing now, especially in the more recent history, let's say the last couple of decades, where in some ways a player's Newton's a really good example, and there are others. A player's greatness limits his college greatness. Newton is the extreme situation because he was so damn good that, of course, he's got to be a college football Hall of Famer. But there will be other guys who maybe, played 1 or 2 really good years, 1 okay year, 1 spectacular year, and then bounced to the pros.
Alabama. How about that one? That's a good one.
Great. See, this is why I have Matt on, because he's always good. He just picks this information from his fingertips that I struggle to come up with. Quintin Williams is a great example. Quintin Williams had one of the more dominant seasons from a defensive lineman at Alabama, not just Alabama, but in college football that we've seen over the last decade or so. And he basically was a 1-year player at Alabama. So how do you judge him when it comes to College Football Hall of Fame in a few years? As opposed to somebody like, let's say, another guy I have in front of me going back in the Wayback Machine, a Kenneth Sims, right, who was a two-time All-American at Texas.
On my list, too.
Yeah, dominant player, was a very high draft pick, but I don't think his pro career really panned out that much. He had some injuries, but is clearly, like, just from his time from playing so much college football, has built up a ton of numbers and was able to accumulate a lot of accolades. So it's another part of this thing that just makes it so interesting. And I end up having a lot of empathy for the people who have to go about doing this because they're in such no-win situations.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I think the reaction, like on social media when the ballot is released every year, is basically the same thing. And right. How dare you not have this guy? Well, they inducted, double-digit people like every year, and it's just hard to catch up. So I think there's some faults with the process. The go-to example every year is that Howard Schnellenberger is ineligible because he doesn't have a winning percentage above 600, even though there's a bunch of old coaches with winning percentages below 600, but the rules have changed. So there are some very, very, very legitimate gripes, I think. But ultimately, it's the type of thing that's never going to please everybody, which is the same with most things these days, I feel like.
Right. And that's a good point. And the coach part of it is an interesting one, right? Because, again, you're trying to put in some type of subjective measures to just be a cutoff. Because, again, if not, you will literally go on forever. There are 78 FBS, define FBS for the Wayback Machine, FBS players on this ballot. And then there's another 99 who played in lower divisions, right? And a lot of those players, again, when you take context into example, like why shouldn't some of those players get the accolades because they were so dominant in college at their level, but only a smattering of those players end up getting into the Hall of Fame, and that's fine. But again, you try to put up some subjective cutoffs to just make it a little bit more of a manageable task, and inevitably what you do is go, oh, but what about that guy?
Exactly.
And especially on the coach's end, because coaching context and where you coached has so much to do with your success, right? I mean, if I put Nick Saban at Vanderbilt, he might do the best job at Vanderbilt anybody could possibly ever do, but I'm sure he would also have no national championships. So because that's just the nature of college football. It's not a sport with competitive balance. So take that into account. There are 78 players. There's a bunch of coaches on here. I'll tweet out the link to the ballot. So if you want to follow along, folks, you certainly can. But Matt and I have decided we're going to try to put together our teams here. So we're going to do that, our Hall of Fame classes off of this year's ballot. We're going to do that. I'm going to take a break real quick here on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. We will reconvene with Matt Brown from The Athletic, and we will go through our Hall of Fame classes for this would be the class of 2021. These guys will be selected and inducted in 2021. We'll do that right after this.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Matt Brown from The Athletic. We are going to try to put together a Hall of Fame class. I'm going to maybe we'll go back and forth here, but you'll give me a guy. If I have that guy, I'll say yes, and if not, I'll go to somebody else. But since you're the guest and you know this stuff really even better than I do, I'll let you start.
All right, I'll start. I mentioned earlier, it seems like this is kind of the time for mid-90s to early 2000s type guys. So Champ Bailey from Georgia, no-brainer to me. Kind of gets overshadowed maybe a little bit by Charles Woodson in that era. Woodson won the Heisman in 97, was a guy who did multiple things, played some offense, special teams, great defender. Champ Bailey, his offensive production was even better than I remembered. If you look back, he had 47 catches for 744 yards in 1998, 5 touchdowns. And if you take that away, he's still an All-American cornerback. So he wasn't on as great a team as that 97 Michigan team with Woodson, but he was a top 10 Heisman candidate, top 10 pick, did a bunch of things. To me, Champ Bailey is the type of guy who's like, yes, that is a college football Hall of Famer instantly.
Champ Bailey is on the ballot for the first time, which makes it kind of interesting. Again, we talk about how sometimes the College Football Hall of Fame is a little funky in its selection process. Champ Bailey is already an NFL Hall of Famer. So I'm not exactly sure why it took him an extra year to get on the college ballot. It might have had something to do with the fact that maybe Georgia was trying to promote some other guys to possibly get in. I think John Stinchcomb may have been in the last couple of years. Sometimes the College Football Hall of Fame also will say, you know what, if a guy's going into the NFL Hall of Fame this year, let's wait a year and honor him in a different year. So again, the rules are a little loosey-goosey at the College Football Hall of Fame, but Bailey, I know, is on the ballot, is being considered for the first time ever, and I would have him in there too. He was just a no-brainer player, and boy, yeah, the offensive production I did not realize was quite that amazing. Like he was a legit number two receiver. On a really good SEC team while being the best cornerback maybe in the country.
He led that 1998 Georgia team in receiving yards. There you go. Pretty good.
Yeah, not number two, number one receiver. All right, so after Champ Bailey, who I also have, who you got?
I have sticking in the same year, but I kind of was going through alphabetical order. So Michael Bishop, Kansas State quarterback, who could have won the Heisman if Ricky Williams was kind of a rare case, at least if you look at it in today's terms, of a guy with that kind of production coming back for his senior season. And Ricky Williams set the rushing record that year, rushed for 2,000 yards, won the Heisman running away. But if Ricky Williams didn't exist, we'd probably be talking about Michael Bishop as the Heisman winner that year. Kansas State was the program that was just so terrible for so long. And under Bill Snyder experienced its not even resurgence, became nationally relevant. And Bishop was fantastic in 98. Unfortunately, they lost that Big 12 championship game to Texas A&M, but he led Kansas State with a great performance to its first win against Nebraska in 30 years. They were a national championship contender. He had an exceptional season. So to me, I think he's kind of an iconic college player, one of those guys who so closely identify with a program and kind of a breakthrough for a program. So for me, I think Michael Bishop had a Hall of Fame college football career.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, that breakthrough too, right? Bill Snyder obviously is the person who will always be the face of the Manhattan Miracle, and building Kansas State football, building Kansas State football from nothing into something that was a relevant national contender and a team that could compete against Nebraska. And you're right, Michael Bishop. I think for the most part, though, I got a different guy I'll get to later on. Michael Bishop was one of the flagship players, was one of the Mount Rushmore players of that era. And I'm imagining if you're a Kansas State fan, you might even consider Michael Bishop one of the, Mount Rushmore players, so to speak, of all of Kansas State football history. I do not have him, so I'll go with a different player. I'm going to try to go with guys who I don't think you might have. I'll throw out Brandon Burlsworth, who is an offensive lineman from Arkansas, played in the late 1990s, graduated in 1998. He was a terrific player. He is a former walk-on. There is an award named after Brandon Burlsworth, the Burlsworth Award. And his story, a lot of college football fans know it, but just the people get up to speed. He was a walk-on. He worked his way up to being a starter at Arkansas and an All-American. He ended up getting drafted, I believe it was in the second or third round by the Indianapolis Colts. And then he died in a tragic car accident within weeks of getting drafted. I think he was driving back from a mini camp from Indianapolis to Arkansas when it happened. So his story is inspirational, but he was also a great player. He was a great player, and there certainly should be room in the College Football Hall of Fame for a player like that.
Yeah, I didn't pick him on my list, but he's one that I 100% endorse. And I don't want to say I'm surprised he's not in already, because it's, the 90s. It's not that long ago based on how the College Football Hall of Fame is picked, but he's one of those guys who feels like inevitable, like he belongs in, he should be in, and I think he will get in. I will flip to, I'm going to cheat here, and I'm going to say that one of these guys should go in this year and one of these guys should go in next year.
Okay.
We're going same era, same position, either Dwight, Freeney, or Julius Peppers. You have two elite pass rushers, both at the college and the NFL level. Freeney at Syracuse, Peppers at North Carolina. I'm trying to vary this list by position a little bit, by years a little bit, so I don't want to use both of them on the list, but maybe you have one of them on the list too. I don't know, but I just think complete dominance from both of them as pass rushers, where we started to more and more recognize how important a stud pass rusher is as the passing game became more important in college football. I think both of those are College Football Hall of Famers, so I think give me one this year and one next year.
Absolutely, both should be in. I had Freeney. I was like, Freeney to me was definite. Freeney holds the record, the NCAA record for sacks per game at 1.6, which is not a sexy record, right? I mean, like, people will, back before sacks were official, Derek Thomas had, I think it was 27 or something.
Something like that,
yeah, back at Alabama. And I think the official record right now is like Terrell Suggs, I think, at Arizona had about 20. But 1.6 per game is not a sexy record. I would be fine with both Peppers and Freeney. I don't have Peppers on my list, but now I'm sort of like, oh, maybe I should put him on there for somebody else. I will definitely have Freeney on my list. And let me think about Peppers. By the time we're done with this, maybe I'll have Peppers on there too.
Well, again, we have lists of like 12 guys when we both could create lists of 40. So,
all right, who you got next?
I will go with Marvin Jones from Florida State, another guy who, I think there's just kind of a backlog of Florida State players in like the 90s. I think we think of Derek Brooks. We think of Charlie Ward, obviously. Marvin Jones left before the 1993 National Championship, but still, 1992, Marvin Jones finished 4th in the Heisman vote. For a linebacker in the 90s, that's pretty ridiculous. Yeah, that was the year before Charlie Ward won. Ward finished 6th that year. Marvin Jones was 4th. So he was on those, every year Florida State was, literally every year they were a top 5 team in the 90s. Jones was toward the, front part of that run. To finish in the top 5 of the Heisman as a linebacker is pretty ridiculous. We don't see that very often. We saw it with Manti Te'o in 2012, but otherwise doesn't happen often. So he's a guy who just seems like another no-brainer for me, even if he probably gets overshadowed by Derek Brooks because of what Derek Brooks did in the pros too. But, Marvin Jones won a bunch of awards, almost won the Heisman, or was at least in the conversation, and was on a bunch of really, really good Florida State teams. So he is on my list.
Yeah, Marvin Jones was also a New York Jet, which of course is near and dear to my heart. And, he was not a great NFL player, but he was certainly a very high level, very good NFL player for a long, long time. I think he had at least one All-Pro season in there. He was a terrific NFL player. I don't know if he would quite measure up to, let's say, a Hall of Fame type NFL player. And again, like, you're right, like, not compared to Derek Brooks, who goes down as one of the great linebackers in NFL history. But yeah, Marvin Jones was a terrific player. I definitely considered him. And again, I actually have another player on here who sort of is near and dear to my heart. I let my Jet fandom get in the way. So I didn't go with Marvin Jones because I got another guy who I let my heart lead me to, and I'll get to him a little later on. So I'm going to let you take this next pick too.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go with somebody who I am 99% sure isn't on your list.
Okay.
And that's because I want to vary the positions and throw a couple curveballs in here. So I am going to go with a kicker. And there are some really good kickers on this list. Sebastian Janikowski's on this list. There's some other really good ones that people will remember from the NFL in the last 20 years, Jason Elam. But I'm going to go with Tony Franklin, Texas A&M kicker from the 1970s.
Very cool.
And looking at the numbers here, in one game in 1976, Tony Franklin kicked a 64 and a 65-yard field goal against Baylor. Then a few games later in the Sun Bowl, he kicked a 62-yarder, which is still the all-time bowl record. So a bunch of really long field goals. I think he still holds the FBS record for most attempts over 60 yards, which that's the type of thing that will, hurt your all-time field goal make percentage, but it just shows how trustworthy he was to attempt a bunch of 60-yarders. So at the time he set NCAA records for most 50-yard field goals made, most points by a kicker in his career. But to have the 264-plus yard field goals in one game, that's pretty notable. So I'm going to give a shout out to Texas A&M kicker Tony Franklin.
Okay, so now a little context here, and this is where my age comes. Tony Franklin was also known as one of the first barefoot kickers.
Yes.
Right, barefoot kick. And back then, they were also kicking off a tee. So with field goals, so it's certainly a little easier, but nobody else was doing that, right? Nobody else was kicking 60 yards.
He was still setting records,
right? He was still setting records that are many of which last through today. So we're not taking anything away from Tony Franklin again. And plus, the barefoot thing was something of a little bit of a mini craze in the late 70s, early 80s. I think there was a handful of others. I seem to remember another kicker, and I can't remember the name, who kicked with not barefoot and not with a shoe, but with just a sock, which was I will Google this at some point while you're giving me your next guy. But I love the idea because you're right. There was a lot of great kickers on there. In fact, I noticed that Janikowski, John Lee from UCLA, I think one of the Zendejases was in here and up for it this year. But I like the idea of Tony Franklin going back and putting him on there. So let me go back to my list now. And you know what? I'll go to the guy who's on here as much because he is near and dear to my heart as a former Jet, as what was a really great college career. And again, this is very much a deserving player. And that is offensive tackle Chris Ward from Ohio State. He was part of some really great Ohio State teams in the 70s. He was a two-time All-American. He was actually a three-time All-Big Ten selection. He was part of the line that cleared the way for Archie Griffin's second Heisman. Chris Ward was a player who was not a great NFL player, but he played for the Jets for a long time. He used to exasperate a lot of Jets fans because he got called for a lot of holding penalties at points, but he was definitely a very good player, a very good NFL player for a long time. He played, again, on some great Ohio State teams. He was a terrific college player. I wanted to get a couple of offensive linemen on here. There are a lot of really good ones to consider. My friend Aaron Taylor from Notre Dame among them. I almost had him on there, but I thought I was being biased because I personally like Aaron, so I knocked him off there. Plus, I don't want him to get a big head. And but I went with my, again, sort of a little nod to my youth and my Jet fandom with Chris Ward from Ohio State.
All right, I'm going to go something that's similar. I'm going to go with my Homer type pick too, I guess, if we're going to say.
Sure.
I grew up around Penn State football. That was, what really got me into college football. I'm 32, so my first college football memories specifically are following the 1994 Penn State team that went undefeated, didn't win the national title. So I'm going to go with Bobby Ingram, who is my wide receiver I have on this list. He was the first winner of the Biletnikoff Award. He had 2 1,000-yard seasons, which are 2 of Penn State's only 5,000-yard seasons. So he was kind of ahead of his time there. Also has 2 of Penn State's 4 200-yard receiving games. Just a deep threat for one of the best offenses of all time, in which he averaged 19.8 yards per catch in 94. But he's also a really reliable, sure-handed, move-the-chains type guy, which is what he ended up being in the NFL. He was kind of had an underrated long career where he was great on third downs out of the slot. But really, really good player for a team that had averaged 47 points per game, led the country in pass efficiency, put up just huge, ridiculous offensive numbers, but didn't win the national championship. So since I have very fond, nostalgic memories of that 1994 Penn State team, I'm going to put Bobby Ingram on my Hall of Fame list.
That was a spectacular team. I realize I don't have a wide receiver on here, and I think the reason why is because I know, again, the way the Hall of Fame works, you'll never have 2 players from the same team in 1 year, so I kind of respected that rule. And with Dwight Freeney in, I did not put Marvin Harrison in. There are other pretty good options here. Here's a great one. It goes back to also what we talk about when we say context, right? Mike Haas, who played for Oregon State in 2005, was a first-team All-American. I believe he may have led the country in receiving yards that year. It seemed like he caught 1,000 passes that year. He was a Biletnikoff winner. Obviously, didn't amount to much as far as a pro career. Didn't necessarily have a really long career. I think he had 2 really good years at Oregon State. But when you sort of think of, again, like within context, like, boy, that guy was such a great, great college football player. I don't know if he'll ever actually be a college football Hall of Famer, but you sort of weigh Marvin Harrison, who's one of the great receivers of all time and is an NFL Hall of Famer, or Mike Haas, Oregon State player who won the Biletnikoff Award, and to think that they're sort of in the same class, like how could I judge these two players? But that's the challenge of doing this, because Mike Haas in many ways had as dominant a one season as Marvin Harrison ever had at Syracuse. So again, I only put that out there just to sort of show how difficult these choices can be.
I like that because a friend and I were playing, speaking of nostalgia, a friend and I were playing the NCAA 06 video game the other day. And we were scrolling through the rosters and stumbled upon him. So 3,000-yard receiving seasons in a row, including...
it was three. He did three.
1,013 in 2003, 1,379 in 2004, and 1,532 in 2005. So almost 4,000 receiving yards at Oregon State. So
that guy he is a Hall of Famer. At some point or another, he's going to probably have to get in there. Okay, so I'll go to my list, and it was a player I mentioned earlier. Kenneth Sims was a beast of a defensive lineman for Texas in the late 70s, early 80s. He ended up being a very high draft pick, and again, it just did not work out in the pros. I believe he had some knee issues. Again, trying to sort of lean between a couple of guys. I think Roy Williams is also on the ballot this year, and I was kind of looking at him, and I probably shouldn't have thrown him out there because I probably will end up with him on there, and trying to balance this out with some positions. But I think Kenneth Sims from Texas is going to be, again, I'm also trying to balance out regions. So not too many Oklahoma, not too many Big 12 kind of guys on here. And I was sort of fluctuating between Williams and Kenneth Sims. But because I have probably a little bit of recency bias, I want to get Kenneth Sims on there.
He's on my list.
Okay.
I was shocked that he's not in the Hall of Fame, honestly. Two-time All-American, two-time consensus All-American, was a unanimous All-American in 81. Top 10 Heisman finisher as a defensive lineman, won the Lombardi Award, fully endorsed. He was on my list. And since you mentioned the other one, I will just say Roy Williams is on my list too.
Okay.
I think one thing, we think about Oklahoma now is where is their defense? Well, at the start of the Bob Stoops era, they were well balanced and great on both sides of the ball, and they had some really, really good defensive players. Of course, they won the BCS championship against Florida State, giving up 2 points. And Roy Williams is kind of just an iconic player from the start of Bob Stoops' really, really remarkable run at Oklahoma, which I realize I might, not to spoil it, we're going to get to coaches and Bob Stoops is on the ballot.
Okay.
So maybe I shouldn't have multiple Oklahoma guys on here, I realize. But whether it's this year or next year or 2 years from now, Roy Williams deserves to be in.
Let's do this. I think you mentioned the Heisman guys, and Heisman guys should get in.
Yes.
There are 2 Heisman guys on the ballot this year, Carson Palmer and Rashaan Salaam. I say at this point, put them both in. I think the time has come for both. Let me take a moment for Rashaan Salaam. Rashaan Salaam died a few years ago, committed suicide. And I think part of the reason why it has been a little while that he hasn't been in here, I think at the point when he was probably, most likely going to get in, then this horrible thing happened, his tragic death. And my suspicion is the Hall of Fame probably wanted to let that lie a little while before they honored him, giving a little time for people to grieve and then honoring him when maybe some of that grieving has passed. So I would not be surprised if Rashaan Salaam is in this year. It's been, I believe, 2 or 3 years since his death. So Rashaan Salaam, who won the Heisman with Colorado in the 1990s, and Carson Palmer, who was the quarterback at the very beginning of the Pete Carroll USC dynasty. He predated Pete Carroll. He was a quarterback Carroll inherited, and then he blossomed under Carroll, the first great USC team. He left, and then USC started winning national championships.
And I will say, too, that I would like to see Salaam get in, because then there's another guy who's not on my list but I think should get in, but maybe after Salaam, and that's Eric Bieniemy from Colorado, star running back on the 1990 national championship team. I think it's kind of a backlog there of some really, really great All-American and a Heisman winner, Colorado running back. So not on my list, but I want to shout out Eric Bieniemy too. Yeah,
that's a good one. And again, it's almost impossible not to think of Bieniemy and Salaam together, because I think that like Salaam basically came right after Bieniemy. and he won the Heisman Trophy in 1994. Again, passed away in 2016. So I think time has come for Rashaan Salam to get in the Hall of Fame. So we knocked both of those guys off the list. Who else you got?
I'm going to go with somebody if I remember correctly, I think I made this case last year, so I'm going to keep making the case. And that is, I don't care how bad his teams were. I don't care how low his completion percentage was. Antwan Randle was just a great, great college football player. 7,400 passing yards, 3,895 rushing yards, 44 rushing touchdowns, 42 passing touchdowns. Just kind of out of place at Indiana, but just came along at an interesting time in the Big Ten where you started to see some, spread offense got incorporated. You saw, Purdue went to the Rose Bowl in one year. Northwestern in 2000 played a bunch of crazy games, brought the spread offense in. Illinois won a Big Ten title in 2001. It's kind of a weird era in the Big Ten, and Randle was, probably the most annoying player to have to defend in the Big Ten in that era. Even though, it was Indiana, they didn't have a ton of team success. If you look at some of his numbers, as I said, like some of his numbers now, they don't look impressive because we've seen guys put up huge rushing numbers and passing numbers, and they do it with, a better than a 50% completion rate. But at the time, he was a really, really, really great player, and to be on the Hall of Fame ballot and be a Heisman Trophy candidate and be an All-American on sub-500 Indiana teams, he really had to stand out.
The first FBS quarterback to have 6,000 passing yards, 3,000 rushing yards in a career. So that sort of gives you a good idea of like where he was a breakthrough, revolutionary type player. Nobody had been doing the things that he was doing when he played at Indiana, and when he was done with his career, he had more rushing yards than any quarterback in FBS history. Now, again, those records have been surpassed. There are more players like him, but he was one of the first, and I believe it was against Michigan. I think there was a famous game that Indiana played against Michigan where Michigan, which never loses to Indiana, was taken to the wire because Antwan Randle was just so damn great. So he is on my list as well. I think we're getting pretty close to the end here. So how many do you have left there? How many have you crossed off?
I have, I think, 3 left, maybe?
That sounds right.
3 left. Or
all right.
3 left at the majors, then we have to get to the lower divisions and coaches. Perfect.
Okay, so let's roll through the last 3 here. Who's your next guy?
You mentioned an offensive lineman. I wanted to make sure I got an offensive lineman. There's several worthy candidates. I went with Robert Gallery from Iowa. Kind of the start of that Iowa run of some great offensive linemen. Was on that shocking breakthrough Orange Bowl team in 2002, blocking for Brad Banks, who finished as the runner-up for the Heisman. Gallery was kind of viewed as like this can't-miss NFL prospect. Kind of just showcased what he was at the college level, which is really dominant. Came along and just helped kind of spur that run where Iowa had a really strong few years there at the start of the 2000s under Kirk Ferentz.
So I'll give you another first-time ballot guy and the Kansas State guy I referred to before, which is Darren Sproles.
Yes, I would have picked him if it wasn't for Bishop.
and without question, and again, I think sometimes that's the way these things work out with the colleges, right? You have to wait a little while because your school maybe wants to promote another guy. So Darren may have to wait a little bit if they want to get Michael Bishop in. But Darren Sproles was just such a spectacular player. I believe he finished third or maybe fifth in the Heisman. In his big years at Kansas State was just, and also one of those guys who we talk about separating the pro and the college. You're right. Robert Gallery was a player who probably didn't live up to pro expectations, but became a good pro player for a while, a starting type offensive lineman in the NFL. So there's certainly no shame in that. But Darren Sproles was one of those guys who because he was so great in the NFL, it sort of validated everything, right? You watched him in the NFL and in college football and thought, holy cow, this guy is crazy. Like, he's so small and he's so impossible to tackle. And I think to a certain degree, like we just all sort of wondered if it could work in the NFL.
Right.
And not only did it work, but it worked spectacularly for like 15 years in the NFL. So I don't want to separate those two things. I want that to be part of what influences this year. And that's why, to me, he's not just a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, because, again, there's so many who should be in. But I don't want him to wait. I want him in now.
I'm not going to disagree. 5'6", 190 is what he's listed at in the NFL. In college, he ran 815 times for 4,979 yards, 45 touchdowns, also had 66 catches, heavy workload, and he's only now just finishing his NFL career.
It's incredible.
Remarkable and amazing, and he was one of my favorite players to watch.
Yeah, and again, another one of those sort of like breakthrough players on a team that was on a breakthrough team, 5th in the Heisman voting in 2003, 28 touchdowns. Yeah, just crazy stuff. And again, in an era, like, he played a little bit before the explosive offensive era, but his numbers still look like he played during this era, right? He looks like one of those guys who like you look at those numbers and you think, oh, he could have played in the 2010s. So Darren Sproles is one of the guys on my list.
Okay, I'll move on now. I feel bad picking one guy or the other because they're right next to each other on the list. So with apologies to Dan Morgan, I'm going to go with another Big East player from that era, and that is Corey Moore from Virginia Tech, who, again, another guy who kind of gets overshadowed by a more famous teammate, and that's Michael Vick. But Corey Moore was a two-time first-team All-American, won a bunch of awards in 1999, was a huge part of that national championship runner-up team in 99. Just, a guy who wasn't an NFL player, really. He was a third-round pick, didn't really play much in the NFL. But I like those guys getting recognition for their really, really, really productive college careers. So Corey Moore was highly decorated, 2-time Big East Defensive Player of the Year. So I'm going to go with him as my turn of the century Big East defender, while also acknowledging that Dan Morgan deserves to be in too.
Yeah, you and Paul Meyerberg from USA Today always seem to remember Corey Moore better than I do. Like, they'll always I've had both of you guys sort of be like, no, Corey Moore. It wasn't just Vic on that team. Corey Moore was awesome. And yes, I seem to remember you maybe having Corey Moore on your list last year as well. I probably did. Yeah, he really was a dominant defensive player in college football. So my other guy is, and I'm almost kicking myself for just putting another quarterback on here, but I do think that there is something to be said for being, revolutionary, for being part of a movement. And Tim Couch was part of a movement. He was part of, a major part of the evolution of college football to what we see so commonly now, these spread offenses, air raids. Tim Couch played for Kentucky. He was a first-team All-American in 1998. He was SEC Player of the Year. He set just a boatload of NCAA and SEC records playing for Hal Mumme. Again, his pro career did not quite pan out, playing for terrible Cleveland Browns team. So who knows if that had changed, if that would have been different had it come at a different time. He played quarterback for the Kentucky team that beat Alabama for the first time in 75 years. He finished in the top 10 of the Heisman voting twice. So, again, I understand to a certain degree, you take a step back and you go, oh, the context of his numbers, he was playing in that offense. But he was one of the first to play in that offense and to sort of showcase that offense. And I think for that reason alone, he is, again, sort of revolutionary player, trailblazing player. So I have him on here.
Yeah, and he kind of like took the air raid mainstream. It's not only, kind of at the forefront of the spread movement, but it's doing it in the SEC. So I totally agree with that one. I think that's a great pick. I think we have one more major, or at least I have one more FBS player on my list, and that's going to be Simeon Rice from Illinois, who is still the Big Ten's leader in all-time career sacks at 44.5. Illinois had some pretty good defenses in the early to mid-90s. Mixed results because this is Illinois football and they don't really have long sustained periods of success. But just look at the numbers, and they still had good defenses in that area. So good NFL career as well. I'm going to go with Simeon Rice as my last FBS pick here.
So I keep waffling back and forth now because this is what happens, and because I'm leading the show, I get to look at my list and change my mind over and over again, and then so I have Peppers down, and interesting, like Rice, Peppers, and Freeney for college players are all relatively close. Now, obviously, they went on to different levels of success in the NFL. All had good NFL careers, though. Freeney and Peppers, another level of NFL career, Hall of Fame level NFL careers. I think I'm going to land on getting Peppers in there just because he was such a tremendous athlete. The fact that he was on the basketball team at North Carolina, played on good basketball teams at North Carolina, and actually was a pretty good basketball player. I know it's a college football Hall of Fame, but again, you start getting into this, like, what makes you famous, what makes you stand out, what makes you something of a transcendent player. So while I've gone through on this list, I've written down my friend Aaron Taylor. I've written down Craig Hayward, another one who's very close to my heart. Craig Hayward from Pitt was a player who I was completely infatuated with when he was starring at Pittsburgh, and I think eventually he needs to get into the Hall of Fame. Roy Williams with the Superman play. So there's a whole bunch here, but I think I'm just going to – Ray Lewis and Dan Morgan.
Yeah, we haven't even mentioned them. Ray Lewis, too.
Ray Lewis and Dan Morgan are on here. Both, again, would be completely deserving. And maybe I should have Ray Lewis on there, but I'm going to go with Julius Peppers and acknowledge the fact that there's just never going to be enough room.
That's correct. Yeah, we could name half of this list, and everybody you endorsed here, I completely agree with as well. So we probably need more offensive linemen. You mentioned Taylor, Steve Hutchinson from Michigan, on and on and on. So I think it's backed up and difficult. So, but what's even more difficult then is the next step of this, I think, which is the non-FBS players, right?
Super hard in some cases because we have like very little information. And I ended up making my pick, and I think it was the same one I had last year. Well, I'm kind of fluctuating between two. I'll just throw it out there. I was going to go with Eric Elias, who played for, I believe it was Princeton now, and now I'm getting the Ivy League schools mixed up, so I will have to scroll down and I will have to see. Keith Elias. Keith Elias played for Princeton in the early 1990s. He was a two-time All-American, Ivy League Player of the Year. Being someone who was in New York and grew up in New York at that time, he just got a lot of name recognition. He was a big story. He was a popular player in these parts because he was so good. I was thinking about picking him and then went back to my Mississippi roots. I've spent some time in Mississippi during my early years of my sports writing career. So I'll just give you mine first. I picked Ashley Ambrose, a Mississippi Valley State defensive back from the early 1990s. Also a guy who went on to a very long and productive pro career.
I almost made that pick because it felt like the obvious one to me because I knew his name because it's a pro guy. But I'm going to go with a safe pick. It's in that I think it's pretty safe to pick a Mountain Union player.
Sure.
And just when I started looking at his numbers, quarterback Bill Borchert from Mountain Union in Ohio has just some of the most ridiculous numbers I've ever seen. 1997, he threw 63 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. 189 passing touchdowns in his career, 14,482 passing yards, 2 national championships, just ridiculous number after ridiculous number. He holds records in Division III for highest percentage of passes attempted that went for touchdowns, 14% in his career, 17.3% in 1997. It's just kind of on and on like this. It's just these absurdly efficient numbers. So I feel like that's a pretty safe pick. He finished his career with 141 touchdown passes to 17 interceptions. Pretty good ratio.
So I think the coaches are pretty easy, and we already sort of revealed our hand there, in that Bob Stoops is up for the Hall of Fame this year. I believe it's the first time for him, and he's got to be a no-brainer, right? I mean, he would be on the very short list of great coaches during his era if we want to cut him up by era, and really his resume stacks up pretty well with some of the great coaches of all time. Yeah,
I think if you look at it this way, like, the coaches for the Hall of Fame are in a vastly different position than the players. There isn't really a backlog of great coaches because there are lots of very good coaches who maybe have borderline Hall of Fame cases that are in the Hall of Fame already. And there's not just, this long list of guys, oh my God, how is he not in there yet with coaches? But Stoops is just one of those no-brainers because he's an all-time great in terms of what he accomplished at Oklahoma. So, I think that's an absolute no-brainer. He's clearly had a Hall of Fame career at Oklahoma and should be in.
Okay, do you have another guy in there then? Because I was looking, you're right, there like the list of other candidates for the Hall of Fame, and not to disparage some guys who had some really great careers, but there is nobody out there who sort of jumps out like, wow, that's definitely a Hall of Fame coach. And again, sometimes you can judge it by just, vast accomplishments, like big picture accomplishments like Stoops, easy, no-brainer, won national titles, played for national championships, won all kinds of conference championships. And then sometimes you come down to a different level where you say, wow, that guy was amazing coach for the schools that he coached at. Right, he turned around programs, exceeded expectations at places. So, is there another coach on there that sort of fits that bill for you?
Well, I think I know who you might go with. So I'm going to go off the radar with people who know me know I like obscure college football history, and so I need to shout out somebody who I also kind of poked fun at a little bit on Twitter recently. So I'm going to make up for that, and that is Glenn Killinger, who I knew well because I have read a lot about early Penn State football. Glenn Killinger was an All-American quarterback in the 1920s for Penn State, one of the best of his era in the early 20s, and he's in the Hall of Fame as a player. But he's also on the list as a coach, or he's a candidate as a coach. One losing season in 37 years as a head coach, mostly at Westchester University, which is a D2 school outside of Philly. A career record of 176, 72, and 16. And I also just happened to buy one of his books. I bought a book from the 30s. It's basically like a football for dummies type book from the 1930s. And I tweeted a couple of screenshots of, there's a couple charts in that book that are pretty funny now that like recommend punting on first down and various things that used to happen in the 30s. And it was amusing, but he was a great, great coach, a great athlete, and all-time. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame as a player. So because I'm familiar with his career and it's off the radar and it's a type of quirky pick that I like to make sometimes, I'm going to say Glenn Killinger should be in the Hall of Fame as a coach.
Yeah, that is a perfect Matt Brown pick, right? That is absolutely, and the fact that right. First of all, apologizing to a person who has probably been dead for dearly departed Coach Killinger.
Our lives overlapped for about 6 months.
Yeah, there you go, and who wrote a book in the 1930s, and you have that book. So yeah, all the perfect Matt Brown pick. For me it was basically Darrell Rodgers or Gary Pinkle.
Pinkle, who I assumed you might say, based on your tease there.
Yeah, and again, Pinkle did a very good run at Toledo, and really took Missouri from a period of time where Missouri football was really irrelevant to a point where they were relevant. I mean, that's probably the best way to describe one, from irrelevant to relevant. Contending for championships in the Big 12. The other one I was considering was Darrell Rodgers, who coached at a lot of different schools and had success at multiple schools. Had success at Fresno State and San Jose State. Won the Big Ten with Michigan State. Had some success at Arizona State. So I thought that was impressive. Again, some of the same vein, doing it at many different places and having success above and beyond what is normally considered success at that school. But I think I'll probably slide towards Gary Pinkle. Again, a little more my contemporary, a guy who I covered a little bit. And again, who took Missouri from a period of time where there was just not a whole lot going on at Missouri to the point where they were contending for Big 12 titles. And then when they moved to the SEC, he won the SEC East twice.
Pretty good. And I will say, I mentioned earlier that I kind of grew up on Penn State football. And my family got season tickets to Penn State in 2000. And our first game with season tickets, Penn State got just pummeled by Toledo, coached by Gary Pinkle. So I endorse it.
Wow,
he made me miserable as a middle schooler.
That would have been like the late 90s rough years for Joe Pa, like during the dark
2000s, the early 2000s.
There you go. Well, Matt Brown from The Athletic, I really appreciate you doing this little exercise. It's a lot of fun. These days we don't have a lot of fun topics to talk about, but I like to try to bring in some fun topics on the podcast to just talk about football and enjoy an hour or so talking about football. I appreciate you doing it with me. Appreciate your insight and your vast knowledge of college football. And thanks for joining the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast this week, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me, Ralph. Appreciate it.
And now 3 and out. First down. Ohio State drew attention for making football players sign what the school calls a pledge, but looks a little like a waiver acknowledging the threat of coronavirus. I understand that feels like a bad look. It just doesn't sit right with a lot of people that the unpaid athlete would have to sign away legal obligation the school has to keep them safe during a pandemic, even though Ohio State says it's not a legal document. It is not intended to be used that way, that it was simply trying to make players understand that there is a level of personal responsibility they need to take for the team to be successfully protected from COVID-19. It might feel unseemly, but it's just a fact. No school is going to be able to completely protect its players from the virus. The players are going to have to take it upon themselves to stay away from the bars and the parties. The schools should be expected to go to great lengths to protect the athletes, but they can't supervise them 24 hours a day, and the virus has lots of ways of breaking through whatever security you put in place. That doesn't mean players should sign away any legal recourse, but the players are going to have to take some responsibility on their own to stay safe. Second down, as I'm recording this podcast, there was a report out of Manhattan, Kansas, that a Kansas State player tested positive for COVID-19 after initial negative tests when he returned to campus. And it's unclear if he was infected after his return. As we talked about last week with Ross Dellinger from SI, initial positives are not that troubling. What will be problematic for schools and athletic departments is infections that pop up inside the bubble they are trying to build. Third down, the latest mini mutiny in college football came at Oklahoma State, where star running back Chuba Hubbard took exception on social media to a photo of his coach, Mike Gundy, wearing a T-shirt with the logo of the cable network OAN. What to say? Let's talk about free speech. Everybody got to speak freely here. Nobody is stopping Gundy from touting his favorite conspiracy theory TV channel. But if you're going to stand behind a network that pushes a point of view that openly and forcefully invalidates the movement that so many of your players are backing, you should expect pushback from your players. Hubbard did that. Apparently, coach and player talked it out, and some things are going to change at Oklahoma State. That's what Gundy said in the video with Hubbard, where the player apologized for not going directly to the coach with his complaints. We'll see how it goes. Gundy can keep doing whatever he wants and saying whatever he wants. But that doesn't mean the players have to play for him. The reality is, at this point, most of them probably have already learned to put up with their head coach and still have fun. And they will most likely go out this season and have a chance to have a really good season, by the way. At some point, the market will decide on Gundy, who has been, without question, one of the 20 or 25 most successful coaches in college football over the last decade. As long as there are enough good players willing to jump on board, he'll keep coaching at Oklahoma State. If the good players decide they don't want to deal with him, then he will have a lot more time to watch TV. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Westwood One Podcasts. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.